gentlemen. And as Dan and Biddy said, this evening marks the conclusion of an 8 years journey in the company of this quite remarkable man, and indeed if he had a phone I'm sure he'd have even been more remarkable. Yes. And this was mainly through the huge volume of the personal correspondence, memoirs, journals, diaries, official papers he left behind, and which are scattered in public and private archives around the world. Now, I must confess that the sheer scope and diversity of Lord Sligo's adventures and undertakings from 1788 until 1845, from Westport to the West Indies, left me bemused, bewildered, and somewhat awestruck. That one human being could accomplish so much in a relatively short lifespan of 56 years and travel so extensively in horse and carriage, write so extensively with ink and parchment, is quite extraordinary. How Peter might have accomplished in this age of social media, the internet and jet planes would not, I'm sure, have filled the pages of one single biography. I think, Dan, you would have had 2 or 3, definitely. Regency buck in the racy, indulgent world of the early 1800s London, landlord of an estate of some 200,000 acres in the west of Ireland, Jamaican plantation owner, Knight of St. Patrick, Privy Councillor, intimate of kings, emperors and despots, favoured guest in the palaces of successive English kings, but also in the homes and palaces of Napoleon and his family. Work that one out. And in the fashionable salons of London and Paris. He was patron of artists and bare-knuckle fighters. He was founder of the Irish Turf Club. He was a friend and fellow traveller of Byron and De Quincey, and you can imagine what these reprobates got up to in their youth. He excavated in Greece, Albania and Turkey. Some of his finds are on display in the British Museum, Room 11, if you ever go there, and they of course are also here in Westport House, where the sarcophagus outside on the main lawn, or on the back lawn, was brought from Greece by him. He was a spy, he was a sailor, he was a prisoner in London's notorious Newgate prison, as well as the father of 15 children. The range and diversity of his undertakings are really breathtaking. Now, oftentimes, especially here in Ireland, to be born with a hereditary title, to own a large estate, to be part of what was known as the ruling ascendancy, brought often with it a presumption of aloofness, greed, even cruelty. What I discovered, however, was a human being, privileged yet compassionate, charismatic yet flawed, who did much good, but who, like all of us, made mistakes. But someone who never let his status in society detract from his innate sense of humanity and justice. From a wayward youth, Sligo transformed into a reforming, responsible, well-intentioned landlord, legislator and family man. He was an ardent supporter of Catholic emancipation. He was one of the first advocates in Ireland of multi-denominational education, and he was a pioneer in the establishment of manufacturing industry as an alternative to the over-dependence on land in the tragic years leading up to the Great Famine. He was a critic of the nefarious legal system that had evolved in Ireland, and his efforts to extend justice to the poorest tenant on his estates earned him the accolade, the poor man's friend, in the most difficult and abject of times. Indeed, Daniel O'Connell, not given to having anything positive to say about Irish landlords at the time, said of him that if every landlord in Ireland worked the same way and was with his tenants in the same way in their difficulties as Lord Sligo, then Ireland would not have turned into what he called a great laser house. As Governor-General of Jamaica, what he saw firsthand of the slavery system there absolutely appalled him and influenced his personal crusade to end what he said was a system so repugnant to humanity. And when the plantocracy, as Lord Sligo wrote, made Jamaica too hot to hold me, on his return he became one of the principal advocates for full emancipation. His pamphlet, Jamaica Under the Apprenticeship System, influenced the great debate on slavery which was held in the British Parliament in February 1838. As the government continued to drag its feet on the issue of freeing the slaves, on the 22nd of March 1838, Sligo stood up in the House of Lords and announced that regardless of the outcome of the government's deliberations, he intended to free all his workers on his plantations on the 1st of August. Such a public pronouncement left the British government, as Sligo knew it would, with no alternative but to implement full emancipation on the same day. So it is very fitting that the first free slave village in the world, Sligoville, is named in his honour. And I think it is fitting that his biography should be launched here this evening in his former home. As Biddy said, there are reminders of him all around the place, and while the Georgian Society, I'm sure, were looking at all the great architectural features, I have a few more to point out. Inside in the long gallery is that very evocative, very provocative, may I say, portrait of his grandmother, Elizabeth Kelly, from whom he inherited his 2 plantations in Jamaica, not from the Browne family, but from the Catholic Kelly family. His grandfather, I noticed he was looking down quite disapprovingly actually, was Admiral Howe, who was one of the iconic figures in British maritime history, and indeed saved England from French invasion in the glorious 1st of June in 1594. So he had the sea in his blood from 2 sides of the family, from Grania Whale, of course, and from his grandfather, Admiral Howe. We have inside and on the front cover of the book, the pictorial, if you like, journey for me was that larger-than-life, massive portrait by Beechey of Howe Peter as a student in Cambridge. And upstairs, that portrait shows a youth full of life, full of vigour, the world at his feet. And if you go upstairs to a very discreet corner in one of the corridors, is a pen and ink painting of him in later life, weighed down with responsibilities and worries and a very, very large family. So in a way, that was the pictorial viewpoint of this story, from a youth of hedonistic indulgence to one of being a responsible father, landlord and legislator. I see here frowning at me in the corner Sir William Scott, banished as he so rightly deserved to a remote corner here behind the scenes. And he was the second husband of Howe Peter's mother. So when Howe Peter, the famous trial in 1812, he kidnapped 3 sailors from a British man of war, and Britain was then at war with France. And he kidnapped 3 sailors from a British man of war in Malta to bring them off to pilot his ship back to Westport with his treasure. And when he arrived in London, back in London, he was indicted by the Admiralty, regardless of the fact that his grandfather had been an admiral. And Sir William Scott here stood trial. He was the judge in his trial. And what Scott says, and I'm sure many eminent law people who are here this evening would certainly concur with what he said. And he said that neither status, privilege, money, wealth or anything else would stand in the way of the law being applied to everybody else. And he sent Howe Peter down for 4 months to Newgate prison and fined him the enormous sum of £500. But to come back to Sir William Scott, on his release from prison, Howe Peter found that his mother, his widowed mother, had married his trial judge. So Sir William Scott actually became his stepfather. May I add that the marriage was not a success, and I think that is why his portrait here very disapproving of women who had wealth, very disapproving of women who showed any inclination for independence, as indeed Howe Peter's mother certainly did. So the marriage was, Howe Peter kept both, as he said, warring parties apart. So we're surrounded today by so many things. We see down here the original builders of Westport House, Howe Peter's ancestors, Browne Wales' great-granddaughter, Maud Burke, who married the first John Browne here of Westport. So it is really, I suppose, so right that the book should be actually published here. Tonight I want to acknowledge Jeremy, late Lord Sligo, to whom this book is dedicated, and who in turn dedicated his lifetime to this wonderful house and estate. Back in the 1990s, it was Jeremy who initially suggested a biography of Howe Peter, neither of us realising then the scope and extent of the undertaking and the time and travel involved. I'm very sad he did not live to see it finished. In 1996, I was privileged to accompany him and Jennifer on an official visit to Jamaica, where the Jamaican government and the descendants of the original inhabitants of Sligoville paid tribute to the contribution made by his great-great-grandfather to the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. As a new chapter in the history of Westport House opens, Jeremy's lifetime of dedication to preserve this wonderful house and estate in what were often most difficult circumstances will not be forgotten, and I am sure will endure. My thanks to you, Biddy, and to the team at Westport House, and to the Westport 250 Committee for hosting this launch this evening and keeping intact that tradition. This is the third book, as you said, I've written about the families associated with this historic house, starting with the original inhabitants of Carranamarth, Old Carranamarth, the O'Malleys, through herself, Browne Wales, launched in this very spot indeed in 1980 by, indeed, funny enough, the late T.K. Whittaker. So things go in a circle. 1983 was Shadow Lord, of course, Tibbet Long, Lord Mayo, and I know, Muriel, you're keeping his tradition alive in the lovely Abbey of Ballintubber. And there are undoubtedly other members of this great Gaelic, Anglo-Norman, Anglo-Irish family, their stories yet to be told. Indeed, I'm almost certain that I saw Colonel John Browne beckon me from his portrait when I arrived. However, for the moment, I can assure you I'm determined to keep my eyes averted until I recover from my journey with his descendant. I would also like to thank my publishers, New Island, for doing justice to Howe Peter's memory with this really fine production, and to the friends and family who, for your support and encouragement over the 8 years of intensive research and travel. But my thanks especially to all of you who have taken the time and trouble, and it's been a horrible evening weather-wise, to join me here this evening in celebrating the life of this remarkable man from Westport. Thank you.